Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. After a day that seemed peaceful, Toan is suddenly attacked and knocked to the ground by two strangers. While Tu Diem screams for help, and a shocking truth about Toan's mother begins to surface. So what will happen next, as Toan's memory starts to return and the danger is far from over? Now let's explore the story of Toan and Tu Diem together. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. Morning arrived early. Light had just touched the edge of the sky when the sound of a blade striking wood echoed in the yard. Toan stood among a pile of dry branches, machete in hand, each cut firm and controlled. There was no rush and no visible discouragement. After yesterday's low corn price, nothing was mentioned. The work simply continued quietly, as if yesterday had been set aside to make room for today. Tu Diem crouched nearby, gathering the shorter pieces of firewood. She stacked them neatly, layer by layer. Her movements were practiced and efficient. From time to time, she looked up at Toan. Her expression was steady. The morning wind carried the smell of damp soil. The air was cool, enough to keep anyone alert. When the fire was lit, it caught quickly. The crackling sound filled the yard, overpowering the wind. The flames rose faster than expected. Both of them adjusted immediately, raising the pile to prepare for possible rain later in the day. Toan passed over the longer pieces. Tu Diem turned and placed each one carefully, firmly, showing familiarity with the task. At one moment, the fire crept close to the banana roots. Tu Diem reacted without hesitation. She used dry branches to redirect the flames and regain control. Heat flushed her face. Toan spoke only once, in a low voice. "Be careful." Nothing more was needed. Amid the smoke and flickering light, their coordination came naturally. The stack of firewood grew taller and more orderly. The work continued at a steady pace. Yesterday's weight no longer lingered. When the flames settled into embers, Tu Diem released a quiet breath. Beneath the fatigue was a genuine sense of relief. It came from starting again with visible, tangible effort. They moved to the stream to wash their hands. The water was icy, biting at their fingertips. No one hurried. Toan spoke about building a brick base for the stove so long-term heat wouldn't crack the concrete. His words were practical and clear, things that could be done step by step. Tu Diem listened and nodded. When the gate lock was mentioned, her eyes brightened. Toan slowed his speech. His voice grew heavier with brief pauses. He talked about staying, avoiding pressure, stepping away from exhausting pursuits. Tu Diem stayed silent for a moment, then replied clearly. She wanted the same. There were no grand promises, just agreement. The space between them grew quiet. Water flowed steadily, leaves rustled softly. Toan looked away, as if reaching for something unnamed. Tu Diem touched his hand lightly. The small gesture brought him back. They decided to harvest early. As they left the makeshift kitchen, their shadows stretched across the damp ground, running parallel. After yesterday's setback, a thin but steady spark of hope moved with them. The field opened under the early sun. Green sweet potato vines stood out against sandy soil. Tu Diem negotiated the price with the landowner. Her voice was calm and firm, 12,000 per kilo if they dug themselves. Toan stood beside her, set down the basket, and cut the leaves away. The soil was loose. Large tubers emerged. Tu Diem noticed and reacted quietly. They looked good. Toan smiled and worked carefully. He glanced at her now and then. The look was subtle but softened. They squatted between the rows, shoulders touching, hands covered in soil, clothes stained. None of it mattered. Toan spoke quietly, almost to himself. It had been a long time since they worked together like this. The happiness was real. Tu Diem responded, her voice slightly unsteady. She felt it too. Toan continued, wishing days like this could last, free from outside complications. Tu Diem looked at the tubers clinging together in the soil and murmured in agreement. They kept working. Laughter mixed with conversation. Sore hands were forgotten. Each tuber lifted became confirmation. Yesterday might not have worked out, but today effort still mattered. The basket grew heavy on Toan's shoulder. Tu Diem walked beside him, supporting the weight. At the main road, foot traffic increased. She spread out a sack and arranged the potatoes neatly. She called out, freshly dug. People stopped to ask the price, 20,000 per kilo. The scale moved quickly. Money accumulated steadily. Toan stood behind her, handing over more potatoes. His gaze followed her movements, calm and assured. When the basket grew too heavy, Tu Diem took it without debate. Toan let her help. The exchange required no explanation. Sales exceeded expectations. Customers praised the taste. Some bought more than yesterday. Near the end, Tu Diem exhaled and turned to Toan. Today went well. He nodded, brushing her hand lightly. No words followed. They packed up, feeling lighter. They stopped at a small shop and bought 2 red chain locks. Tu Diem paid. Toan tested the keys and smiled faintly. The familiar food stall welcomed them. The smell of spicy noodles filled the air. Tu Diem spoke first. Today was her treat. Toan nodded. 2 bowls of spicy noodles and 2 glasses of guava juice arrived. They ate slowly. The spice made her wince, but she continued. He asked. She said it was fine. As they ate, she mentioned coming here before. Toan fell quiet. His expression dimmed briefly as memories remained incomplete. Tu Diem placed her hand over his. She said she would wait. She would stay. Their glasses touched lightly. The sound was small. In the busy stall, their bond stood firm. The past was incomplete, but the present was enough to move forward. The afternoon moved slowly. The sun had softened, no longer harsh like at midday, just strong enough to stretch long shadows across the dirt road leading home. Toan and Tu Diem walked side by side, close enough that their hands brushed against each other. Their fingers remained intertwined. Their steps were steady and in sync. The warmth from lunch still lingered, holding a sense of calm after a full day of work. As they left the market area, the road gradually emptied. Voices and engine noise faded behind them. On both sides, low fields and quiet rows of trees stood motionless in the light breeze. The silence was deep enough that the sound of footsteps against dry ground became clear. Within that stillness, the sound of an engine rose from behind them, growing louder by the second. A motorbike suddenly sped forward. The sharp burst of the throttle cut through the air. 2 men rode on the same bike. In just a few seconds, it overtook them, swerved sharply, and stopped across the road, blocking their path and forcing Toan and Tu Diem to halt. Dust rose and hung in the afternoon air. The bike came to a full stop. Both men got off and stood directly in front of them, the distance uncomfortably close. One of them spoke first, his voice dry and harsh, calling Toan by name. There was no familiarity in the way it was said, only control. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Tu Diem slowed by half a step and instinctively moved slightly forward, shielding Toan. Toan stopped completely. His shoulders tightened. His gaze remained fixed ahead. The two men did not waste time. They stated their purpose plainly. They demanded the password to the bank card. They said they were enforcers hired by Toan's mother. Their job was to force Tu Diem out of the farm as soon as possible. The card had already been handed over to them. Only the code was missing. Their words came fast and cold, with no attempt to hide their intent. Toan shook his head. The movement was slow but firm. His voice was not loud, not angry, but clear. He said he remembered nothing. His memory was gone. What they were saying brought back no images, no recognition. His eyes did not avoid them, but there was no challenge either. Tu Diem stepped forward another inch and positioned herself fully between Toan and the two men. Her shoulders were squared, her voice held steady. She said they were mistaken. There was no such thing. Each word was spoken clearly, without trembling, without retreat. The tension escalated quickly. One of the men took another step forward. The space closed abruptly. A shoulder slammed into Toan. He lost his balance. The fall came without warning. His head struck the hard dirt road. The sound was dull and heavy, enough to tighten the chest of anyone who heard it. Tu Diem cried out and rushed forward on instinct. She grabbed the man who had shoved Toan, using both hands, even though she knew her strength was not enough. The other man stood close by, his expression wavering as he looked down at Toan lying motionless on the ground. Tu Diem's scream for help burst out, frantic and raw, echoing along the empty road. Toan lay still. His eyes were closed. His breathing was heavy. Blood seeped from his temple and darkened the dry soil beneath him. Tu Diem dropped to her knees beside him. Her hands shook visibly as she cradled his head, trying to keep it steady. She called his name again and again, her voice breaking with fear. The sense of safety built throughout the day vanished in seconds. The once quiet road felt heavy. The air seemed to thicken. From a distance, hurried footsteps approached. The two men exchanged a quick glance. Hesitation flashed across their faces. Then both turned back toward the motorbike, jumped on, and sped off. The engine roared. Dust exploded into the air as the bike disappeared in the opposite direction, swallowed by the falling light. The figure approaching from afar was Thu. The uniform made him recognizable immediately. His steps were decisive, without hesitation. He knelt beside Toan, checked him quickly, placed a steady hand on his shoulder, and called his name. His voice was low and controlled, keeping the situation from spiraling. Toan stirred slightly. His eyelids twitched. It took a moment before he opened his eyes. His breathing remained heavy but more regular. As awareness slowly returned, he spoke. His voice was weak, but it carried weight. He said he remembered now. He said the two men had been at the farm before. The words came in fragments, but they were enough. Tu Diem froze for a brief moment, then wrapped her arms tightly around him. Tears spilled freely. Relief washed over her, overwhelming the fear and exhaustion. Thu listened without interrupting. When Tu Diem began to explain, he stayed focused. She recounted everything from the beginning, carefully and clearly. She said the two men had identified themselves as her enforcers, sent by Toan's mother. It was Toan's mother who had hired them, with the explicit purpose of driving her out of the farm. She explained that the bank card had been taken under pressure, but the password had never been given. The Yu acknowledged each point, his tone firm as he confirmed the details. He said the matter would be investigated and handled according to procedure. He did not say much, but it was clear this would not be ignored. Toan slowly pushed himself upright, still dizzy, using one hand on the ground for balance. His eyes were different now, Something had returned, not completely, but enough to steady him. Tu Diem held his hand tightly and did not let go. She spoke only a few words, but it was enough to show how frightened she had been. Thu gave brief instructions, reminding Toan to rest and monitor the injury. Then he stood, looked at them once more, and walked away, leaving the road quiet again under the fading afternoon light. The evening wind swept through, colder than before. Toan and Tu Diem stood up slowly. Their steps were no longer as even as earlier, but they moved in the same direction. Their shoulders touched. The road home felt longer, but it was not empty. Each step carried pain and fear, but also a renewed certainty, fragile yet strong enough to keep them moving forward.